All right, with me today here is Charles Lister, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and the director of the Syria Initiative. He specializes in Syria, terrorism, and insurgency across the Levant. He has his own newsletter, which is a fantastic newsletter with really good insights and information coming out. One of the top experts in Syria, a person who 6 months ago was the busiest person on earth, I would say, because of what was going on. And with that introduction, Charles, thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar. Much appreciated your coming in.
Sure, thank you so much for having me.
So I think the first question is a question I'm going to make a little bit more general, and that is we're almost 7 months, I would say 7 months since this tornado storm that came in from the north that took over Syria, a regime change in Syria, the fact that what was there for many years changed almost overnight. It was just a few days to weeks before we saw a complete toppling of the Assad regime. So we're 6 months into this event. It's enough time to kind of see where the direction is going, but also enough time to see what are the gaps, but also some of the disappointments and so on. So looking into this situation that has been going on for the past few months, where would you put Syria and its leadership today in this situation? Where are they heading, and what do you think is going on right now that we should be noticing?
So, great question. I could head in a number of different directions to answer it, because, as you say, it was a sort of earthquake development in December last year with the fall of the regime. Came after nearly 14 years of debilitating civil conflict, but also after more than 50 years of the Assad family's pretty brutal and certainly dictatorial rule over the country. And so I think the first thing to sort of bear in mind or acknowledge right from the outset is that the structural challenges in Syria after, again, not just 14 years of conflict, but more than half a century of dictatorial rule are enormous. And in many, many respects, it wouldn't matter what the makeup was of a transitional government. The inordinate challenge of getting past many of those obstacles and structural deficiencies is really genuinely hard to grasp. And so the challenge is enormous. And I can perhaps go into some of those. I think to specifically answer your question, I would say the Syrian transition led by Ahmed al-Shara, who I guess in President Trump's words has a strong history. In an analyst's words, spent many years in Al-Qaeda and clearly has a very questionable history. But from the perspective of his leadership, the last 6 or 7 months, I would say, have been enormously positive. So for him and his leadership, considering who he is, what his history is, what I call the rush to Damascus that the international community has undertaken over the last 6 to 7 months is basically unprecedented. I don't think you could find any post-conflict country anywhere in the world in history that has seen, at my count, 71 foreign governments travel to the capital in 6 months. So we have seen an enormous rush to Damascus, and as a result of that, an almost immediate lending of credibility and legitimacy to this transitional government. So again, to sort of reiterate, from the perspective of Ahmed al-Shara and his transitional government, the last 6 to 7 months couldn't probably have gone much better, considering their history and considering the enormous challenges that Syria faces and would face no matter who the transition was. In terms of stabilizing and trying to move forward. And of course, the biggest game-changing development in that respect has been the decision by President Trump first, and then his administration to fully engage, to lift sanctions, and to basically open the door for real substantive economic engagement in Syria. That's the big game changer. Now, we shouldn't expect, just on that specific economic note, we shouldn't expect the economy of Syria to suddenly recover and everything to suddenly get much better. This is an economy in which the Syrian pound has lost 99% of its value over the last 10 years. This is a country in which 90% of the population live under the poverty line. Over 50% of Syria's basic infrastructure is destroyed. So that's everything from residential buildings, roadways, medical infrastructure, education infrastructure. 50% of it's destroyed. And so, just by itself, the reconstruction challenge is really genuinely sort of hard to fathom. Um, to give you a sort of anecdote on that, the World Bank privately talks about the reconstruction costs in Syria potentially being as high as $500 billion. But then what they also say and haven't publicly acknowledged is that even if that $500 billion somehow miraculously existed in the Syrian central bank, Syria simply doesn't have the transport infrastructure to move around the kind of scale of construction materials that would be required to actually undertake a reconstruction effort of that scale. Again, almost unprecedented. So, from the economic perspective, from the reconstruction perspective, we're facing an almost unprecedented challenge. So if we are looking at economic recovery, it's going to move at a snail's pace at the outset. But there are positive signs. The World Bank today just confirmed its first grant, not a loan, but a grant to Syria in more than 40 years, $146 million grant for electricity infrastructure. Qatar and Jordan are now moving ahead on a major natural gas supply project for Syria that would, I'm told, within 6 months, double the electricity supply to the average Syrian household. Thanks to Qatari financing, public sector salaries are about to go up by 200%, which in theory would raise 1.5 million households in Syria out of the poverty line, which would be a very dramatic sort of economic shift in terms of living standards. So there are positive signs, but it is going to move forward slowly. And then all of that's before you come to the security challenges, which really, after 14 years of war, couldn't be much more challenging. Sorry for overusing the challenging word. But we have an enormous, what's called in the lingo, DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration challenge, where we have HTS, or what the remains of HTS and their many armed opposition allies. That probably numbers close to 80,000 armed men. We then have the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led umbrella in the northeast of the country, which command probably roughly about the same number of armed men and women. We have the remnants of the entire Syrian regime's military and militia structure, which is probably, again, another equal 80,000 plus armed men across the country. And then we have the reality that for many, many years, the Assad regime played on minorities. Of course, Assad himself came from the Alawite minority, but the regime weaponized minorities. And the idea that the Sunni majority would always or could always have been a potential existential threat to Syria's many minority communities. And so we're in a place now after 14 years of conflict where communities all across the country on a village level have armed themselves to the teeth for self-protection over the last 14 years. And now we have a new government, a transition in which, ultimately speaking, a central government should have a monopoly over the use of force. And yet the entire country is armed to the teeth for potential self-protection. So getting over that sort of DDR and a monopoly over the use of force challenge is a mammoth, mammoth challenge. And within that, of course, we've seen several bouts of pretty vicious sectarian conflict, which is Syria's worst nightmare. I think, to be particularly cold and blunt about it, that violence has been horrific. But the fact that, and one bout in March with Alawites on the coast and one bout with the Druze in the south in May, the fact that both of those bouts of violence petered off within 2 or 3 days is a really encouraging sign. Again, notwithstanding the horrific level of violence that we saw, the fact that it didn't then spiral into something that was uncontrollable tells you something about Syrian people's mindset, which is, despite a great deal of paranoia, insecurity, and fear about what the future holds, and of course, deep-seated historical grievances, Syrians don't want to find themselves falling back into another spiral of uncontrollable escalation and violence. And so again, if I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can be on that note, I would say that that's our sign of optimism, that there are triggers and that there are roots for sectarian violence still very much in place. And it will take years, if not decades, to get past them. But ultimately, Syrians don't want to collapse back into that kind of a conflict. And so local mediation and government mediation has, by and large, still successfully de-escalated those couple crises that we've seen over the last few months. And then finally, I'll just touch we'll just throw out two other things. We still have the issue of terrorism. ISIS has not gone, and I'm sure we can come to talk about that. But in many ways, ISIS and like-minded groups are showing increasing signs of a real danger to the transition and also to Syria's minorities. And then we have geopolitics, which is, the age-old problem that Syria has suffered for over the last nearly 15 years. Israel has made it quite clear that it feels highly insecure given the nature of the transitional government, and it has acted on that insecurity. Turkey, in many ways, as a response, has sought to deter Israeli military action, and we've seen a near face-off between Turkey and Israel over that. We also have the Gulf coming in with great deals of money and geopolitical sort of investment, and the very real prospect that as the economy opens up, there may be newfound areas of competition and potentially even rivalry within the rest of the region in terms of shaping what Syria looks like. So geopolitics remains a challenge. Iran is in the mix. And has certainly played a role in trying to foster an anti-government insurgency. And of course, Russia is still around. So there's lots and lots of things that I could touch upon to answer your question, but hopefully that gives us a good start.
So we are looking into a situation of a nation building, and definitely there's all the institutions, and the institutions not only per se in terms of, for example, building an education ministry or infrastructure and so on, but also the civil institution, i.e., what is the type of democracy, if we are going to see a democracy, what is the type of governing regime we will see. And I think this leads me to the question that I like to call it the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde question when it comes to, are we talking about Mr. Ashara, or are we talking about El Giuliani? I.e., is he the person who is going to be leading this nation building is a person that has, like you said, a very, well, let's call it a sketchy pass, kind of a not a very smooth kind of a Harvard graduate pass. But on the other hand, he's really doing tremendous thing. He's probably one of the only ones who could have taken this entire thing and kind of move forward with it. So where do we see him in all of that? How do we interpret him as a personality? That's question number one. Two, if he's gone, because we put that on our risks for 2025, the assassination of attempt on him, because he's probably like the number one person targeted by a lot of people in that area. If he's gone, who takes over? Is there an institution behind him, or it's really a one-man project at this moment?
So great questions. I'm just jotting them down so I don't forget. So on Ahmed al-Shara specifically, I think we're now dealing with Ahmed al-Shara and not Jolani. And I think, to be frank, the face of Ahmed al-Shara that the world has seen since December the 8th, when he marched into Damascus, is by and large the face that has been presented to 4.5 million people in northwestern Syria under his rule since 2018 or so. So it's not a new face. It's not something that he suddenly embraced marching into Damascus. This has been a long evolution in terms of his posture, his agenda, his vision, his rhetoric. And, to give you another anecdote to that, and not to get into too finite details in history, but when Ahmed al-Shara rebranded his movement to something called Jabhat Fath al-Sham in the middle of 2016, so we're talking, nearly a decade ago, his then spokesman, who at the time was actually an Australian Saudi, who was very, very well spoken, completely fluent in English, very eloquent man, gave a series of interviews to Western media, CNN, BBC, and others. And you can go back and find some of these interviews online. He used 9 years ago the exact same language, literally, word for word, the exact same language that Ahmed al-Shara used and HTS used publicly on the first days that they had taken over Damascus. So this kind of idea of embracing the revolution and having a sort of multi-ethnic society and within Syria's rich diversity, seeking to reunite the country, phrases and phrases and phrases had basically been created in Ahmad al-Shara's kind of mindset and agenda nearly a decade before he took to Damascus. So the first thing to really understand is that this isn't a sudden change. This isn't a sudden identity change that has developed over the last 6 months. There is a deep and long history here. Just frankly speaking, not many people were paying attention to it. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that Ahmed al-Shara grew up in an upper middle class family in Damascus, in the most expensive neighborhood in Damascus. He went to one of the most expensive private schools in Damascus, in a family which was, highly educated, well connected to the government or to the regime. Um, he has basically re-embraced his kind of childhood persona in his newfound leadership position. And this kind of elite Damascene, young, educated persona is the way he's presenting himself to the people. Not as a jihadi, he's not wearing camouflage outfits, he's wearing suits and he's wearing that, and he's speaking as an elite Damascene. So even his dialect and his language and rhetoric has changed. And when I was in Damascus in February, which was still pretty early days for the transition, I was stunned to find, and this was, I was traveling all around Syria, but during my time in Damascus, had happened just a few days after Ahmed al-Shara had revealed his wife and his young daughters to the public for the first time. Of course, if you were still Al-Qaeda, there's no way you'd be revealing your wife and your children to the public in any kind of a way. But what stunned me was that Syrians, including from other minority communities, had taken photographs of him and his wife or him and his two young daughters as the screensavers on their cell phones. So he, as an individual, appears to have been highly successful, I think, at presenting himself as a sort of transitional leader and one that has some credibility and legitimacy. I think the question about trust and faith comes much further down the rung of the ladders. People underneath him, to the fighters, to the armed groups. That's where popular distrust, paranoia, insecurity does really come into play. So I always draw the distinction between him as the self-presented transitional leader and those underneath him. With that being said, I would also, say, and I met a number of regional foreign ministers over the last few months, and obviously, without mentioning any names, some of them who you would have expected to be the most skeptical and cynical of someone of his character have come out, and for example, one of them used the words, "I was in awe of Ahmed al-Shara after his first meeting with him several months ago." So he appears to have the kind of charisma and intelligence that has convinced regional states, including those who are deeply skeptical of political Islam, that this guy has something in him that might just be able to hold Syria together amidst all of these many challenges. And that's definitely a consensus view that has emerged within the US intel community and the military. In fact, the incoming commander of US Central Command testified to the Senate yesterday for his confirmation hearing and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but said that the stability of Syria means the stability of the United States. And the only man capable of bringing that stability is the president. And it is very important to us that he remains the leader. So remarkable, transition from US perspective as well. But there's clearly a consensus view that there are very few people, if not almost nobody else, who would actually be capable of holding all of this together in such a fragile situation. So that leads me to answer your second part of the question, which is if he was assassinated, I would be extremely worried about Syria's stability, very, very quickly, extremely worried. There have been a number of developments that have not gone publicly reported over the last 6 months within the transitional government, and particularly within his Ministry of Defense, which have shown to me that if he wasn't the man in charge, everything would have fallen apart already. And so he is that kind of iron grip over the transition that holds things together. That doesn't mean, though, that he's going to be a kind of Jeffersonian Democrat. There will be elections for the parliament, for the People's Assembly. Whether there will ever be elections for the president, I'm less certain. I think he sees himself as a kind of Syrian MBS, not as a Syrian Thomas Jefferson. And so that's quite acceptable for many in Syria and many in the region. And again, from the outside, we have to sort of temper our expectations a little bit about how much we expect him to ease his hold over the reins of power.
A Syrian MBS, that's a great phrasing for him. I think that's a very good kind of a catchphrase there. So he came from definitely from those jihadist movement that were the ones that were basically involved. There were, I think, at some point like 800 groups in Syria of different types. It was a complete chaos during the civil war. Now, a lot of them were basically, and a lot of them came from outside of Syria, and a lot of them were kind of endorsed into the security apparatus as a way to kind of not to disarm them, but to have them as part of the regime versus just outside of the regime. How is that process going? And is there any kind of progress that we see that is leading to something which is positive, or are we seeing some difficulties already, specifically when we're talking about those what we call the foreign jihadists that flew into Syria and are still there? What's going to be happening with them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's the most thorny, complicated challenge that I would say from a security perspective he faces. More challenging than all of the sectarian divides and grievances is this issue of foreign fighters. Let me just introduce it with some additional context, which is to say that from the point at which Ahmed al-Shara and his movement HTS consolidated dominance over northwestern Syria, which would have been roughly in 2017. Once HTS had established its dominant place in the northwest, it established its dominance basically by squashing and dealing with more mainstream Syrian opposition actors. It set its attention to dealing with the jihadist milieu in northwestern Syria. And that it set about dealing with that by subjugating those who were willing to be subjugated under his authority and to be part of a project that was becoming more politically active rather than just a military jihadist outfit, but something that was much more politically active. It had a government, it had a semi-technocratic government. So he set about subjugating those who were willing to go along with that and viciously dealing with those who were not. Many at the outset were assassinated. Others were thrown in prison. Hundreds were thrown in prison, some of them foreign fighters who were very quietly, subsequently actually deported to some of their countries of origin as a way of building confidence with several foreign governments. And many others were simply expelled to other areas of Syria. So there's a history here in terms of perspective that the vast majority of the foreign fighters who were in one way or another aligned with HTS as it advanced south to Damascus were foreign fighters who for 7 or 8 years had been wholly willing to be completely subservient to his specific authority. and who never said a bad thing about having a semi-technocratic government, having political relationships, albeit quiet ones, with with part of the international community, about having a permanent United Nations office with UN staff living in HDS's capital. So when we're talking about how does Ahmed al-Shara deal with these foreign fighters, it's a comparatively less challenging subject because we're dealing with foreign fighters who haven't been a problem up until now. Now, that's not to say that they are completely easy to deal with, but the fact that we have seen what we have seen, which is particularly the Uyghurs, there's about 3,000 of them who were part of a movement called the Turkestan Islamic Party, subsumed into their own division within the Syrian armed forces, the new Syrian military. I have to say, for me, I was stunned that this was given a US green light. I definitely didn't see the Trump administration being quite as kind of pragmatic and nuanced to allow something like that to happen. But this was never a challenge that had any kind of a good solution. Originally the Trump administration demand was that they'd be expelled from Syria. Well, I mean, let's face it. How do you expel 3,500 foreign fighters? Where do you expel them to? Who's going to take 3,500 foreign fighters crossing the Syrian border into their territory? Nobody. They're certainly not going to be willingly deported to their countries of origin. So that condition was never a realistic condition. It was just completely impractical. And I think the reality at the conclusion was that the least potentially dangerous solution was taken, which is these men have been willing to submit to our authority for the last several years. If they continue to be officially under our authority, they will continue to submit. And it is much easier for us to control them, to know where they are, to deploy them to specific areas of the country where they may not become a problem if they are within our official remit, which is why they're now under the Ministry of Defense. Now, before that decision was made, months and months ago, 6 foreign fighters were given senior positions within the new Syrian Ministry of Defense. A Jordanian, I think 2 Egyptians, 2 Uyghurs, and someone else, I think he was Bosnian. Now, those 6 promotions, so to speak, generated quite some international criticism, and I think rightfully so. And as far as I still understand, those 6 men no longer have those positions of authority. So it's not that the government was given some complete kind of, green light to do whatever it wanted here. These 3,000 men aren't in senior positions of authority, and I suspect they will be watched very, very closely, in the coming months and years. And whether or not they end up getting given Syrian citizenship, I think is probably an open question. The argument from the government in Damascus is that giving them naturalization is yet another way for us to more easily control them. But I don't think they've been kind of given a green light to do that just yet.
One of the other aspects is not about the Syrians that are in Syria, is the Syrians that are outside of Syria, the refugees that left the country during the conflict. We know a lot of countries in Europe, primarily going from Germany, but also other countries, really want to solve the issue of the Syrian refugees in order for them to be able to return. Turkey, of course, as well. How would you kind of analyze the refugee situation? Are they coming back? Are we seeing some issues there? Or what are the main struggles and what are the main successes that we have been seeing in the last few months?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, it's a huge priority, obviously, for Syria's regional neighbors, but also for Europe. So we've seen around 500,000 Syrian refugees return in the last 6 months, and that's out of, at least 6, if not 7 million. So not a huge rush to return, but 500,000 in 6 months isn't an insignificant number. There is an expectation that that number will tick up this summer, assuming Syria remains stable. For a very simple practical reason, which is that almost all refugees are families, almost all families have children, children have been in some form of schooling as refugees in these neighboring countries, and Syrian families didn't want to pull their children out of school mid-school year. Syria is right now in the midst of examination season, so that basically tells us it's almost the end of term. So once the sort of summer holiday period kicks in, there is at least an expectation, if not a hope, that we will see a larger swelling of movement back into Syria later this summer into the early fall. But that does still depend on the stability inside Syria. And of course, it also depends on the economic situation, the prospects for people to find work, whether or not they still have homes to go back to. So there's a lot of, more granular complications involved. But on a simple from a simple perspective, there is a flow back, a returnee flow, and there is expected to be an intensification of that flow in the coming months. The reality when it comes to refugees who are in Europe is I expect that their expectations for what they need Syria to look like for them to justify a return are higher than the expectations for Syrians who are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan and Iraq. And so I don't expect we will see anywhere near the same kind of flow from Europe for some time. Syria's transition is going to take years. Its economic recovery will take many years. And I think that will stem the flow of returnees from Europe. One other thing to flag on this issue, which is that that Syria's humanitarian crisis today is actually worse than it's ever been. Now, that isn't because Assad fell. It was already spiraling exponentially last year. It's primarily because, A, the economy is still in such a terrible, terrible place, worse than it's ever been. But it's also because international donor support to the aid effort in Syria is lower than it's ever been. So right now, the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Fund, which is designed to meet the minimum needs in Syria, is 9% funded for 2025. So the UN, which is still running an enormous aid effort in Syria, is only capable of meeting less than 10% of the humanitarian need in Syria, which is like absolutely kind of gobsmacking lack of capacity. And in that situation, there is actually a slim risk that some parts of Syria will continue to see people leave. And again, I think that's less a reflection of the transition and there not being Assad's regime anymore, and much more a reflection of the fact that the humanitarian conditions in Syria are so desperately bad. And yes, the economic window has been opened by sanctions relief, but it will take a long time for the effects of that economic window opening to really be felt by the common Syrian civilian. So if aid donor funds are not increased and better supported, there is a risk. I don't want to sort of overplay this, but there is a risk that some Syrians will still feel the need to flee purely for those very basic economic humanitarian reasons.
What is the main center of gravity, I would say, that the current Syrian government is seeking to achieve when it comes to the economy? What are their main economic goals right now? Is it infrastructure? Is it getting the currency? Is it foreign investment? I mean, where do we see them really putting the emphasis right now?
Well, the first goal was to win international credibility and legitimacy and see sanctions removed. That was the first goal. Very simple, much less about economic policy and much more about PR and diplomatic engagement. By and large, that's been accomplished newly as of the last few weeks. Syria is now back into the SWIFT system, had its first international transaction from Italy earlier this week. That's a milestone. First, legitimate international transaction in nearly 15 years. And so that was the first goal. The second goal is to show that with that achieved, to try to convey to the Syrian population that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And here are our plans to show you that path. And in that respect, the kind of picture that is being painted is that the primary priority is energy. So, in Damascus, still to this day, unless you have a generator, you get about an hour of electricity a day in 24 hours. So right now, electricity generation is the number one need. Right now, it's 38 degrees Celsius in Damascus. And if you are a normal civilian, you are desperately hot with no power throughout the summer months. So electricity generation is the number one priority. That's where we have a Qatari proposal to finance the purchase of natural gas and pump it through the Arab gas pipeline through Jordan into Syria to the Deir Ali plant south of Damascus, which is the primary power plant that feeds into the national grid. There was a working call, a virtual call about that this morning between the Syrian, the Jordanian, and the Qatari governments to try to move things forward in that respect. So electricity generation, that was also the cause for a $7 billion memorandum of understanding signed in Damascus a few weeks ago in the presence of America's special envoy to Syria, Thomas Barak, who's really the point man on Syria policy, given his very close relationship with Donald Trump. And that whole $7 billion MOU was to build huge power turbines in 4 different locations of the country and 1 massive desert solar array in order to add about 6 hours of additional electricity per day to the Syrian national grid for all citizens. So electricity and power generation is really the number one need and the number one message in terms of immediate objectives that the Syrian government is trying to convey to its people. After that, the bigger kind of almost philosophical vision that the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Information Technology, which has really been pushing the boat in terms of the vision for the country, is that Syria will become, in their eyes, a hub in the region, a hub through which telecommunications, electricity, oil, gas, trade will pass through, linking the Middle East with Southern Europe, linking, the Gulf with Lebanon and the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. So Syria isn't going to be this kind of dominant exporter of anything much, but it could become the kind of regional transit hub that, quite frankly, the Middle East hasn't really had for a very long time, if ever. Going back into modern history, given its geographical location, it can play a vitally important role as a hub. And there are a number of contracts that have already been signed that are pointing in that kind of hub direction. A submarine telecommunication cabling deal with Cyprus and Greece that would come through the Mediterranean into Syria and then pass into other areas of the Middle East, including Jordan and Iraq. Gas pipelines that the Turks are planning, linking Iraq with Turkey and Europe through Syria. And of course, the Arab gas pipeline, which has been a reality in terms of a physical pipeline, but hasn't been active for many, many years, linking, in fact, Israel with Israel through Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula into Jordan and into Syria and into Lebanon. So again, the hub is the kind of vision that is being painted, certainly to the international community. But to conclude, I would just say that the real kind of urgent vision that's being painted to the people is energy generation, electricity, and of course, bringing more liquidity into the market to allow people to be able to put food on their table in a way that they, quite frankly, haven't for many, many years.
So you mentioned the Qatari and the Jordanian deals. I just want to read a question from the chat here. What are the terms and conditions that the Qataris and Jordanian ask for on their investments? If you can share some light about that.
So it's a good question. I mean, to be blunt about it from the outset, I would say the conditionalities are the basic conditions that you would normally expect, that any form of investment, whether it be into a pipeline or high voltage power lines, are protected and secured by the state, prevented and protected from sabotage, from theft. Of course, Syria for many, many years, its electricity infrastructure has been consistently destroyed by vandals who just cut down the cables and sell them as scrap. Cut down wooden electricity power pylons and just sell them for scrap wood. I mean, it's been, that bad all across the country. So the core condition is pretty basic, which is just that whatever infrastructure is either rehabilitated or newly constructed as part of these deals, the state will be responsible for protecting and securing those investments and that infrastructure. Beyond that, there's not a lot of other conditionality, in large part because when you look at the Qataris and other Gulf states, their vision for Syria is that, Syria has been this kind of open wound in the heart of the Middle East for so many years. It's also been, an epicenter of Iranian influence. It's been the jewel in the crown of Iran's regional, revolutionary agenda. And the Gulf wants it to be precisely the opposite of that. And the only way of achieving that goal is to stabilize the transition. So for the Gulf, it's primarily simply about consolidating the post-Assad reality and ensuring that this transition stabilizes, in most of their eyes, ensuring that the transition broadens in terms of representation as well, but primarily so that it stabilizes. And then for the likes of Jordan, the regional neighbors whose economies are also in pieces, it's that Syria being that hub becomes a hub that also stabilizes and benefits their economies. And Jordan and Syria have focused a lot of their bilateral engagements over the last 6 months around the issue of trade. Jordan is desperately in need of trade picking up across the Syrian border. And huge amounts of cement are being sold from Jordan into Syria on a daily basis now. The last I heard about 10 days ago or so was that every day, approximately 1,500 tons of cement are crossing from Jordan into Syria every few days. As of today, Jordan and Syria just did away with a diesel toll on all trucks and buses that cross the border, which until recently had really stemmed a lot of the cross-border trade because it was a very expensive toll. So there's a real emphasis on trying to just simply pick up the trade relationship. And so again, from Jordan's perspective, they're not expecting much from Syria other than stability in southern Syria in order to facilitate an uptick in trade. And a more stable environment in which that trade will occur. It doesn't go much further than that as of now.
So we're entering the last 15 minutes, the last quarter of our conversation. So I want to take it from the nation building and the internal status of what's going on in Syria to the more geopolitical picture, a little bit about the actors. So I'll start with the one that was on the news recently, obviously Iran. So as you said, this was the prime jewel of the Iranian kind of the proxy network that they had, with Hezbollah being the arm, and the logistical base was Syria as a transition point for not only weapons but also for the rest of the stuff that Hezbollah was going through. Now we're seeing a Syria that is basically looking even at Israel and looking at past nemesis and saying, we're looking inside, we want to rebuild, we don't want to have enemies. So what can you tell me about the situation and the relations between Iran and Syria as of today?
I can say there is basically no relationship. When Assad fell, Ahmed al-Shara and the transition issued a number of public statements suggesting they didn't want problems with anybody. I think actually a lot of that initial signaling was aimed at Israel, but it was also aimed at countries with which they'd had hostile relationships, like Iran. Russia took very early steps in the post-Assad environment, as in within 24 hours, to signal that they wanted to have a fruitful relationship with the new Syrian government. Iran did not. And so, long story short, is that there hasn't really been much, if any, there hasn't been any official face-to-face diplomatic contact. There have been a couple that I'm aware of, sort of diplomatic kind of cables or messages sent, but that's as far as it's got. I am aware that through the IRGC, Iran has attempted to support an anti-government insurgency, primarily on the Syrian coast in Latakia and Tartus. There was very clear evidence of that in March, when there was a huge spike in insurgent attacks against government forces in the hours before the horrific violence that we saw take place from March 7th through to the 10th. There have been continued suggestions that Iranian assistance is still in play, but that anti-government insurgency has almost vanished over the last couple months. In fact, for 6 weeks in a row, they've conducted 0 attacks all across Syria. And so in many ways, the government itself have actually done a very good job in terms of targeted raids all across the country to put a stop to that insurgency and to negate Iran's ability to foster the kind of instability that they would seek. And of course, the government has also almost every single day now seized and intercepted Hezbollah-borne weapons shipments. Many of them of Iranian-made weaponry, Iranian-made artillery shells, anti-tank weapons, and ammunition headed towards Lebanon through Syrian territory. Now, some of that's been intercepted crossing from Iraq into Syria. A lot more of it has been found in Homs, in the old Hezbollah strongholds, in western Homs near the Lebanese border. But the government in Syria has done a sort of methodical job at intercepting these weapon shipments. And again, that's both a challenge to Iran and its regional agenda, and the way that the government has been making has been presenting these seizures and interceptions in state media and other platforms is clearly intended to be a message to Israel that this new Syrian government is doing what the Assad regime never did in terms of actually putting up, in their eyes, a steel wall along the Lebanese border to prevent weaponry from transiting Syria into Hezbollah hands. So the messaging is there. The reality on the ground is very, very visible. There are multiple large-scale seizures being intercepted every week. So clearly, on the Iranian angle, there is still activity. They are still seeking to use Syria in that way. But now they have a government who's actually visibly and determinedly opposed to it, rather than, of course, the Assad regime, which actively facilitated it from day one.
You mentioned Israel, so I want to touch on that. Israel, from the get-go, took over the area next to the Golan Heights, established there some positions, and established very strong tie with the Druze community in the south, and also some of the area, the population in that area that are not Druze but that are living in the south, offering to work in Israel and so on. Where do you see this situation between Israel and Syria going? Because the level of mistrust, I spoke to some Israeli senior former officials and so on from the security apparatus. The level of mistrust is at the sky. There's no, I think Iran and Syria, the mistrust is very high. Where do you see this is going in terms from the Syrian perspective? Do you feel that there's a level of mistrust that will kind of guide the relations toward confrontation, or there is really hope to kind of make a change and to maybe open a new page, even leading to some sort of a recognition and negotiations in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically both. There is a lot of mistrust. And again, specifically as you asked it from the Syrian perspective, I mean, there's some cause for that. You know, within 24 hours of Assad falling, about 200 square kilometers of Syrian territory was suddenly occupied. And then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Israeli airstrikes hit all across the country. And that's not the greatest confidence building measure with a new transitional government. So to be blunt, there is plenty of mistrust and I think some pretty deep frustration at that reality. As I think I said a little earlier, there was a very early message that the transitional government put out, I think even on December the 8th, the day that they first took Damascus, that didn't name Israel, but was clearly intended specifically to Israel, which is that we don't want problems with any of our regional neighbors. Well, they weren't going to have problems with any of their regional neighbors except perhaps Israel. It was a very clear signal. When I was in Damascus in February, I was pretty bold, and I basically asked the question you asked, which is, can you foresee there being a path towards first a non-aggression pact and then ultimately official diplomatic, engagement and recognition with Israel? And it's not an easy question to ask in Syria, but as you know, given all of the history. But basically, the answer was yes, because we need it. And Syria has such a long path to tread in terms of recovery that we really can't afford to have problems with any of our neighbors. And so, to be blunt, yes, there's still plenty of distrust. The reality is, for example, because I track this stuff so closely, from last week, there were 25 Israeli ground incursions into Syria in 7 days. That is not a way to build trust. When you look at all of the statistics, we've had nearly 1,000 Israeli air and artillery strikes in Syria since Assad fell. We've had over 300 ground incursions since January the 1st. And in all of that time, the Syrian government and forces linked to them haven't conducted one hostile act towards Israel. In fact, the most assertive that the transitional government has been in response to those military actions has been to lodge UN Security Council formal complaints. There has been one attack by an Iranian, or apparently by an Iranian kind of front group, which was, just a week or two ago. And that to me was an illustration of what I had feared for the 6 months preceding that, which is that Israel's understandable, but also I think non-strategic military actions were going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy in which ultimately at some point someone was going to want to lash back. And then, of course, the fact that it has, is a sort of feeds that vicious cycle, which is now there's been an attack, albeit very, very rudimentary and basic. It then justifies further military actions, which then hits the very little confidence and drive to engage that was in place in the first place. So it is a real source of frustration and worry for me, because I think it's unnecessary. The government in Syria made it very, very clear from day one it did not want to have a problem with Israel. Behind the scenes, it has been conveying to Western diplomats since day one that it is open first to a non-aggression pact and secondarily to official diplomatic engagement. But to get there, it can't only be Syria that has to give concessions. The additional occupation of territory and military action with impunity isn't going to create an open door in Damascus to political recognition. There has to be confidence building measures on both sides. And that's the kind of challenging place that we're in right now. Just to give you another example. So today, President Ahmed al-Shara met with a delegation that came from Quneitra and Western Dera, precisely because there is increasing popular frustration along that disputed region, that the Syrian transitional government isn't doing anything to protect them from Israeli military action. So it's from the transitional government's perspective, this is a desperately difficult position to be in, because they don't want to have to respond, because that then locks us into this vicious cycle of tit for tat. And yet, if they don't respond, they're being seen by a significant proportion of their population as refusing to defend Syrian sovereignty. So the longer this carries on, the harder it's going to get to where I think both sides ultimately want to be, which is first a non-aggression pact and secondarily official political diplomatic recognition. So there is a path to get there, but both sides have to back down, not just one.
So we're in the last 5 minutes. I have two more questions. One of them is in the same angle of the geopolitical one. Where is Turkey in all of this? Is Turkey taking advantage of Syria? Is Turkey seeing Syrian stability from a strategic point of view and basically taking kind of I would say a godfather view that makes sure that Syria is protected in return for some geopolitical benefits such as bases and so on? Where do you see those relations between Turkey and Syria going, and where are they, you think, going to advance to?
So I always speak for too long, so I'll try to be more concise in my answers. I think it's complicated. I mean, naturally, for obvious reasons, Turkey had in December last year the most natural sources of leverage and influence over the transitional government, given who they are and given, of course, where they came from, right along the Turkish border. But also, the transitional government made it very clear, as I understand, almost from day one, that it didn't want to be seen as, it didn't want to be perceived as a puppet of Turkish influence. And so it was not a coincidence that, the first trip Ahmed al-Shara made abroad was to Saudi Arabia. It wasn't a coincidence that there have been many more high-level diplomatic meetings with the Saudis and the Gulf states than there have been with Turkish officials. And that's not to say Turkey doesn't want to get there, but I think they are also cognizant of the reality that Turkey doesn't have billions and billions of dollars to invest in Syria. The Gulf does. Turkey's opportunities economically in Syria will be as the contractors for construction and shipping and transport and what have you. So there is a kind of regional balance to be had here that meets both of their interests. So I think over time, Turkey has been more willing to step down a couple rungs down the ladder in terms of, I think, what it initially hoped for, which was to be the kind of godfather in the way that you described it. Hakan Fidan and Ibrahim Kalin were the first two, foreign dignitaries to visit Damascus after Assad's fall. That also wasn't a coincidence. They wanted to be there. They wanted to present themselves in that way. Now, there has been a military accord signed with the Syrian Ministry of Defense that stipulates Turkey's ability to establish bases in Syria to cooperate and to, provide some kind of service and support to Syria, particularly on the sovereignty level and the counterterrorism level. But we haven't actually seen much of that activate. There was a period of time where it looked like we might, and that led to the big standoff with Israel over the T4 airbase in the center of Syria. Since then, we've seen the Turks really take a step back, which I think is encouraging for obvious reasons. So I guess, long story short, it's not that Turkey doesn't want to be the prime player in Syria, but I think it's now increasingly recognizing that if it sought to be that way, it might actually damage the long-term prospects of the transition and of Syria's recovery, and having a more balanced relationship is actually in its interests. That seems to be where we are for now.
So the last question we always like to conclude our webinars with is with a scenarios question. And
Mhm.
essentially there are three scenarios that we look at: best case scenario, worst case scenario, and a black swan. So if you can kind of look at Syria and think about what is the best case scenario for Syria, what is the worst case scenario for Syria, and what is the black swan when it relates to Syria. If you can kind of give me shortly those three scenarios as you see them, as you perceive them.
Yeah, so I mean, best case scenario, realistically, the best case scenario is that we continue on the path we're on now, which is a messy, a very fragile transition, but one in which baby steps are taken in the right direction. A transition that increases in its representation, that engages more effectively with all aspects of Syrian society, that the SDF in the northeast eventually and gradually integrate into the state. The economy opens up, investment comes in. That's the best case scenario, but it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be completely clean. There will be continued violence in Syria for a long while to come. But the key is that things move in the right direction on a chart. And so that, I think, frankly, we're basically in that place now. But the best case scenario is that continues. The worst case scenario is that something in Syria triggers a dramatic escalation in conflict. There is a very real danger that is likely to come from, if it happens, that it would come from the likes of ISIS. There's another group in Syria which appears to be a front group of ISIS called Ansar al-Sunnah, and they were responsible for the suicide bombing in the church outside Damascus on Sunday. That is very clearly an attempt by an ISIS-like movement to replicate what was done in Iraq after 2003. And there are real parallels here. In Iraq, we saw the flip from Sunni minority to Shia majority. So we had a sectarian flip in a country in which there is complex ethnic and sectarian balances and imbalances, deep historical grievances. complex geopolitics, occupying forces, people and a population armed to the teeth, etc., etc. Syria is precisely the same. It's a perfect opportunity for the likes of ISIS to do exactly what it did in 2003, which was to spark sectarian conflict in order to challenge a very fragile and somewhat controversial transitional government and bring it down on its knees. And so for me, that's the worst case scenario. And the church bombing was a very real signal of what that might potentially mean if more of that happens. And I will just leave this worst case scenario by saying 12 similar plots to what we saw take place on Sunday in the church outside Damascus. 12 similar plots have been foiled over the last 6 months. So there is a clear, determined effort by ISIS to do exactly this. And that would be very dangerous for Syria, given how fragile the sectarian balance is. And then in terms of a black swan, for me, it would be the assassination of Ahmed al-Shara. I mean, that would change the game. I don't actually think, and this is not me saying I'm any kind of fan of Ahmed al-Shara, but he is clearly the kind of personality that can hold things together. If he was taken out, I don't think there is any kind of a natural successor. There really isn't. There is nobody else with the same level of internal credibility, legitimacy, with the right kind of history, and with the international backing and charisma to hold things together. And that would be the kind of black swan incident that, as we've heard from US officials, is a very real concern. That there are apparently active attempts to try to assassinate him. And there have been at least 2 plots foiled to assassinate him by external actors in the last 6 months. So that for me would be the black swan.
Fascinating. Charles, thank you so much for taking the time talking to me here and for joining us in this Q&A webinar. I can say for myself, this is a topic that we can go on and on and on and on for another 3-4 hours, and I don't think we would cover even a fraction of the amount of stuff. So I would like to recommend everyone, if this is a topic that you're interested. Charles, you have a newsletter in which you cover Syria on a regular basis. I do recommend you to take a look. Where would you tell them to look for it, Charles? Where is it that they can find the newsletter? Is there like a website with your name?
It's called Syria Weekly, and it is literally syriaweekly.com. So yeah, everything is on there.
So I highly recommend you to take a look at it. Very insightful, and also the analysis itself is brilliant. And I really enjoyed the conversation today. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, thanks for having me, Oren, and to everyone here, keep in touch. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a note.
Thank you, and thank you everybody who joined us. Our next webinar, oh, that's a good one. I think it's tomorrow. I think tomorrow we have another webinar about Iran. It was planned before the attack on the Qatari on the air base in Qatar, and before the ceasefire. So as events go through, we will have tomorrow another webinar about Iran. And next week, I think we have about Russia. So if you stay posted on our newsletter, we'll promote that as well. Thank you, everybody. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.